Can I avoid paying inheritance tax is an age-old question, a very common one that pretty much everyone asks themselves. And you may or may not have heard, but that people say inheritance tax is pretty much the only tax which is voluntary, because it's the tax which is payable upon death based on the value of your estate. So just a quick recap, if your estate's worth over a certain amount of money, you're going to have to pay what currently is 40% on anything over that amount. If it's under it, you're going to pay no tax at all. So it's voluntary in that if you start giving money away in your lifetime and you keep it below that amount, you won't have to pay tax on it. Now that is subject to something called the 7-year rule. So if anything you've given away within those last 7 years of life may well be assessable and added onto your tax bill. But let's say you give something away and you survive 10 years, it will not be included in your estate valuation. So it is definitely a voluntary tax, but obviously it all comes subject to when you've given things away. So 40% on anything over your tax limit, which currently is £325,000 per person. If you are a married couple, then you can smile, because when Gordon Brown was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what he did was bring in a new allowance, and it's called a transferable nil rate band. The nil rate band is basically the amount of money you can pass on free of inheritance tax, and it's transferable because what he said was, if the first person to die leaves it all to the partner, then number one, there's going to be no tax payable on that, and number two, it's not going to count as part of person number one's inheritance tax allowance that they've been given. So the second part of this is that then that you say, right, if that allowance hasn't been touched, or there's some of that allowance left, partner number two can take it and add it to their own to then, leave the joint estate on second death to perhaps the kids or whoever it might be. So as a married couple, you've actually got £650,000, and that's like a standard rate. Anything over it, again, you're paying 40%. So if you've got an estate worth £800,000, traditionally you'd be paying 40% on that £150,000 excess. Now, there has been a new development in inheritance tax over the last few years called the residential nil rate band, which basically gives an extra amount of money that we can put towards our main property, whereby we still don't pay tax on it. So I'm going to do a separate video on the residential nil rate band, but the long-term effect of it is that as an individual, you now could leave potentially up to £500,000 at 0% inheritance tax. And as a married couple, because we can do this transferable nil rate band, it also applies on the residential nil rate band, we can transfer it over. The second partner on death can potentially leave up to £1 million of inheritance without paying a single penny of inheritance tax. So just remember, inheritance tax is involuntary. It is voluntary, I should say. It's definitely a voluntary tax. It all comes down to how much you plan and things like that. But obviously there are lots of rules that you have to be aware of, because you can't just give it away willy-nilly and cross your fingers and hope you've done it right. You need to get specialist advice to make sure you've done it in the right way.